Opposites are to the left and right of the stage. Slight change from your programme. Unfortunately, Hannah Daly can't be with us today, so our TD Jennifer Whitmore is going to speak to our newest councillor, Eoin Ó Broin. So I will leave them at it.
Thanks very much, Sheila. So unfortunately Hannah couldn't make it, and when we were thinking, well, who will we talk to and what expert can we bring in? The fantastic thing about our party is we have so many experts in-house that we didn't need to look too far. So we have Cllr Eoin Ó Broin, who's our newest member of the representative team, I think. And so we're just going to have a chat, right? So this is it's an environmental chat amongst friends. I'm going to go to the audience a little bit as well because I want it to be a bit more interactive. But first I'm going to talk to Eoin and ask him about his background and what area he works in, so he can give us a little bit of context, and then we're just going to talk about climate change, climate actions, the targets, what we need to do, what we're not doing, and just have that conversation. Okay, Eoin, off you go.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm the 20th county councillor for the Soc Downs. I'm very proud of that. And I know Professor Hannah Daly, who was plans to come here today, because from 2014 to 2017, we worked on the same EU project, which was modelling solutions for low-carbon futures for the whole continent and globe to 2050. We're energy systems modellers, which means we attempt to represent society, the housing sector, the transport sector, the industry sector, the electricity production, and use models, which could be as simple as an Excel sheet, or it could be more complicated using C programming or MATLAB or something else, to find pathways to low carbon futures. The emissions, they could rise rapidly and then descend slowly, or the curve could go like that. So what we're doing is trying to find the least cost scenarios, and we can undertake mathematical optimization to find them, or you can do it simpler, which is in a linear fashion. The key tool you use, believe it or not, is the carbon tax. So in the model, you keep increasing the carbon tax until you get the changes that you're looking for. It can be criticized as it can't all be about carbon taxes. And what the response to that can be that everything else, which is on the demand side, retrofitting and electric cars and things like that, are very, very small measures which are hard to target in the models. So a high carbon tax just represents many different measures. And it's like if all these things are happening, you could estimate what's called a shadow carbon tax, which would be necessary to make things happen. I studied electronic engineering in UL. I wanted to work with the environment there. There was a great environmental society. So I found a master's in Sweden for engineers that want to work with the environment. It was called industrial ecology. Just for info, all masters in Sweden are in English and they're free of charge, completely free. So I did one of them, and they said, would you like to stay and do a PhD in this energy systems modelling focused on the building sector? So that's how I got into it. And in the energy modelling world, they would say everything started with the oil crisis in the 1970s. Before that, there was no real focus on efficiency. There was loads of oil. And it was easy just for first world countries and developing countries to just build out large centralized systems where you have huge nuclear or oil or gas power plants and you distribute the electricity. But then with the oil crisis, things starts to change.
Okay. And I suppose what's really interesting for me in all this as well, because this is my first real conversation with Eoin, and what Eoin doesn't realise is there's all these jobs I have in my head that to get you to do for us now, Eoin, when we're dealing with the climate stuff. But I suppose, I don't know, I would imagine you all saw last week that the EPA came out and said, look, Ireland is way off target, emissions are actually going up. And even if we implement every single aspect of what the government is saying they're going to do, it's not going to be enough. So that's a huge red flag for us, a big, big problem. And so, Eoin, do you think, what's your assessment? Are we on track for those targets, and what are the challenges in actually meeting them?
Don't think we're on track. The targets are internationally agreed treaties. You might say, some people say Ireland's a small country, can we make a difference? Not really compared to China, that's true, but on a per capita basis, we can make a big difference. People in developing countries say, well, why should I reduce my carbon footprint if people in Ireland don't? And we have signed up to these legally binding treaties. The Green Party set an ambitious target of 7% per year reduction in emissions. The numbers are nice, but on the ground, when you think about what would that look like, it would look like way less cars on the road that are using petrol and diesel. So there are many alternatives, but we're not on track there. Where I live, young people buy a car as a way, it's independence. It's a form of reaching adulthood, and it's still, because of their frustrations as a student with getting around, it's still felt as a thing. Once I get that car, I'll be on my own and able to manage things better. Well, I don't see, whereas when I lived in Paris, nobody had a car. A car would be completely impractical. And because there was a metro system, there was suburban rail, there were trams, and the bus was the fourth choice. A monthly ticket was €80 a month, all in. When I came back to Ireland in 2017, I rang Dublin Bus and said, how much is a monthly ticket? And they said, 140. And I said, does that include the Lewis? And they said, no, you have to get something else for that. But since then, we have leap cards and things, but I don't see that if I just look at transports, you can't see it on the ground, really.
Yeah, and look, I absolutely agree with you. It's one of the biggest frustrations, I think, when, I'm in the Dáil and I'm listening to all the plans, and I think we do have to give credit to the Greens for getting the framework in place, for getting the act in place, and that in itself was a big thing to get done. But it's not just about getting the targets in, it's about how we're going to meet those targets and how quickly we're going to do it. And there isn't when it comes to the implementation, we're just not seeing the implementation. And the implementation that is being proposed isn't fair in how it's been proposed. And that's probably, for us as a party, one of the biggest issues, because as I was saying earlier on, we need to make sure that we bring people with us. Like this, when we talk about climate, this should be such a positive conversation that we're having. Like, the benefits are enormous. And we saw even, biodiversity, we saw during over COVID, people were enjoying getting out walking because the streets were closed off to cars, so they had their kids out cycling. They were getting engaged more with nature, and you could really see the positives. So whilst we were dealing with obviously a very, very difficult situation, the mental health benefits of people being able to get out and walk and cycle in a healthy and safe manner were just, enormous. So this should be a really positive conversation that we're having.
We have transitions in society all the time. We've had transitions from horse and cart to car. In the 80s, we started transitioning from heating your house in Dublin with oil or coal to natural gas. What happened is the natural gas, when gas was discovered in Kinsale, the pipelines were laid to the urban centres. The pipeline was laid on streets that had plenty, through all estates in Dublin. And once that pipeline network was laid, it was a no-brainer to switch, because you didn't have to deliver coal, you didn't have to have oil delivered, it was piped in directly. And that was obviously a positive transition. No one was criticising that. We need more transitions now, and in a sense that's all they are, but for sure there's a lot of fear out there, and that's something to be dealt with. Just on that housing thing, the fact that pipe network was laid by the state made it easy for people to almost plug and play into getting gas heating. Stepping forward to where we are now, I see people are getting individual houses retrofit. So you might have in an estate with semi-Ds, one person is getting the external insulation, the other isn't, whereas it would be more economical for both to get it at the same time for a whole estate. But those solutions, we're far from those kind of solutions. An only analogy I can think of is if a district heating network was laid all throughout the city, then people could plug in and some could use the existing radiators, some would need new radiators, but it would be much cheaper for the individual than expecting them to pay a lot of money to first renovate their houses to B2 and then to pay more for a heat pump. Look, I mean, if you can do that, it's beautiful. Like the house is warm, and it's carbon. Your heating system is zero carbon. But expecting the numbers to do that in the time frame is a tall order, I think.
And I suppose it comes back to as well is like where we differentiate from the other parties is that we see, particularly in times of crisis, that the state really should be the one intervening and providing the solutions. Whereas I think the likes of, Fianna Fáil and the Greens and Fine Gael would rely more on the private sector. So we have a housing crisis, and it's the private sector is expected to provide the solutions for that, whether it's through rented accommodation or through building. Similar with this, with climate, it's the private sector. So the one-stop shops are private entities, and we're expecting them to roll this out.
I think Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will only choose market-based solutions. That they've demonstrated that for the last 2 or 3 decades, and I wouldn't expect anything different from them. It would be quite surprising if they did.
And it's not, in times of crisis, you need the state to really do the heavy lifting, and that's really what we would expect the state to do, and to really step in.
They do make it as an either-or solution. When I lived in Sweden, I spoke to a political actor. I was in the Green Party in Sweden, I should confess that. But so one of my party colleagues there, he said what he thinks when he was talking about healthcare. He said the state should be a provider and can set the standard. So let's say with social housing, if the social housing provided was state of the art, it would set the standard for the private developers, because the state can do it without the profit motive, do it nicely. So he said, we're not looking for communism. There can be private actors, but let the state set the standard here. But in our case, the state's provision of housing is not where it should be. There's not the staff and there's not the resources to do it in a way that people would say, I want that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm just going to, I know we don't have the timer on, so I'm just wondering if those people in the control, the brain section over there, could you put the timer on, because I just don't want to be given out to by Sheila. Where is she? For going over. So like when we talk about all the different aspects and all the different promises and commitments that the government is doing, right? So and the things that we need to do to meet our targets, I suppose there's a few key areas, right? The biggest one is the renewables, right? So wind production. The next biggest one is retrofitting. And then we have the likes of EV. Like they seem to be the sort of the 3 key things really that the government is relying on doing it. And when you look at each of them, there's problems with all of them. Like none of them are actually meeting their targets. And I suppose for me, my biggest fear is that we're going to hit 2025, 2026. And then, we're going to realise actually, it's too late. We don't have the infrastructure, the capability. So
you'd wonder there, we just stick with the renewables and wind turbines, and it's a fact. The wind speeds off the coast of Ireland are, between Ireland and Scotland, they're the highest in Europe. People talk about the renewables endowments. So the Sahara Desert, Southern Europe, has an endowment of solar. We have an endowment of wind, which should be exploited. Should there be a state company leading the way and pushing for the deployment of these wind turbines offshore? Because perhaps some of the developers are adopting a wait and see. Perhaps they're international actors, so they might prioritise another country before Ireland. I think most of them would be international.
They're international, and actually what they're finding most difficult is a lack of clarity from the government. So they know that that there's a timeline that they have to hit, and they're putting quite large investments in, because obviously the state is not doing it. And for them, they find it very, very challenging working with Ireland, because they don't know what framework they're working in. They don't know what legislation they should be adhering to. They don't know, is there going to be a marine protected area where I'm going to be putting my wind farm? They don't know all these things. And I know, because I have spoken to the industry, and they are finding that very difficult. They go back to their investors, and their investors are saying Ireland is the craziest place to do business when it comes to this kind of stuff, because there is no clarity, and yet there's an expectation that we'll invest. So, I mean, that's a major issue. And I think when it comes to, there's a real focus at the moment on the East Coast. I don't know how many of you live on the East Coast, but we will essentially, if it comes to fruition, there will be wind farms down from Dundalk to Wexford, you know. But there doesn't seem to be as much focus on the West Coast, where the real opportunities are. Like, I think there's technological issues there, and there, you know, the government is like, right, we'll deal with the East Coast first, and then we'll deal with, rather than just throwing everything at it. And we had, I can't remember if it was the SEAI or the department were into one of the climate committees, and they said, was it Airgrid? The government said something like, the government's asked us to look at how we can do this quicker and how we can ramp up. And I'm like, because of the energy crisis, that was it. And so when the energy crisis hit, the government said we need to do it quicker. I'm like, hold on, we're in a climate crisis. How are we not throwing everything at it? How is there still capacity within your systems to ramp up even more? We should be doing 120% already, you know. So
the RC makes sense in the sense that it's beside the load, it's beside where most people live and use energy, and it's shallower than the Atlantic, and it's the weather is calmer for maintenance. So there's not, you know, no one lives in the sea as such. I don't know how far out they'll be. Where's Ross? Like, you know the answer to this. Will people be able to see turbines from the shore?
Yeah. I think it's like, is it? Yeah, I think it's 12 kilometres.
12 kilometres.
Yeah.
It's Codlin Wind Park off Wicklow Town. It's 12 kilometres out, and you'll be able to see them all the way from Graystown to Wicklow Town. But 12 kilometres out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But is there a bit of chimney stacks versus turbines? You know, anyway, maybe it is easier than the Atlantic for certain.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of uninhabited islands off the west coast. I haven't looked into this, but you'd wonder if they wouldn't be ideal spots for turbines, because you know, it's easier.
Yeah. Ciarán, do you want to?
I might just chip in there as well. My name is Ciarán McCarthy, Cork West. This is I work as a barrister, specialising in marine law.
Sorry, Ciarán, do we need a mic? Yes. Would that help? Okay. Is there a mic somewhere for Ciarán? It's not often you need a mic for a Cork man, mind you. I might be outnumbered here, right? Wicklow crew, we could get in trouble.
Party chair. She's a nationalist Cork woman. Just to, I think it's a very interesting conversation you're having, and just, I suppose, to touch on the point that Owen made there as regards legislation, or lack thereof. Because I've worked on this quite recently, I can categorically assure you that there's absolutely nothing. And I've had international clients sort of like ask me, you know, about the legislation, and I'm kind of like, guys, you know, how can I drag out this opinion? You know, it isn't there. And what is there is with a horrible mixture of maritime law and planning law at the moment dealing with this issue of offshore wind farms. So we have maritime law dating from 1894, Merchant Shipping Act is applicable when we had sailing ships, basically. That's still in the statute books. The Brits took theirs, they made it for us, but they got rid of their one quite a long time ago. We still have it. What we do have is literally dozens of enactments, various acts and delegated legislation covering this area, specifically as regards offshore wind farms. The legislation that we need, that the UK has, for example, specific to the offshore world. We have some stuff from the 80s dealing with, as Owen referenced, the Cllr wind farm. We just made specific legislation there, which does not apply in any way to offshore wind farms. It's specific, it even talks about, you know, oil or gas. It just isn't applicable. As regards the sort of legislation that we need, which is specific legislation allowing them to build wind farms, to service them, to have particular types of ships, particular types of crews, particular ports, we have absolutely nothing of that on the statute.
You make me think that it'll go a lot faster in Scotland because they have the...
Definitely. I can say for certain that when we're using the exploration vessels, etc., and the very specialised vessels that we need to do this, we're going to get them from Scotland. We just don't have the infrastructure here. And another point that I might make as well, because I have sort of attended a few, I wouldn't call them greenwashing meetings from people who are in industry, who are trying to push this stuff. It's chaos. It's the Wild West. Somebody mentioned the distance of the wind farms from the coast, and that will be an issue. I mean, these guys, they would build a wind farm in the Liffey if they had to. The reason is simple. The further out they are, the more cable costs money. So you want your energy right beside you. So yes, they're going to make an absolute mess of the East Coast if they can. They'll do it badly. The legislation isn't in place to deal with it. The West Coast stuff that they're talking about at the moment is pie in the sky stuff. They're talking about mooring vessels a long way out to sea. It's not going to happen.
Floating turbines.
The floating,
It's not going to happen anytime soon. What's going to happen is somebody's going to develop the idea and then sell the idea, but we still won't have the wind farms. So it's a maddening situation to be watching it, and it's really interesting to listen to talk about.
Yeah, and like I think for me particularly, because like obviously I'm like in Wicklow, right? We're gonna it's very hard because we need these wind farms, but they need to be done in a responsible way, and. You know, we're talking about the planning and getting those regs in and getting the laws in, but what we're not also taking on board is the biodiversity needs. And it was the one thing that I've sort of always I try not to talk about the climate when I talk about biodiversity, because they're just so interlinked. And I know there's a new group, and I'm just so delighted to see them up and running, is called Fair Seas. And it's an umbrella organisation that actually have developed, and they launched during the week, a report putting forward what they think the MPAs where they should be. And actually it's interesting because the entire East Coast should be an MPA, and that's based on a lot of, like they've had scientists look at this over the last 6-9 months. So it's great to see this is happening, and it's hopefully will start the conversation, because government has put its head in the sand, because what it's wanted to do, I think, is move forward with the planning and the wind farm stuff and bring the biodiversity stuff after the fact. But the risk, and even the wind farm people are saying this, the risk for them is that their decisions will be, they'll go to judicial review, and that's...
It's like with the SHDs that the state wants the developers to write the legislation and then let it happen.
Well, there is a planning act going through that's sort of literally like a county development plan for the sea, and that will sort of say you'll be able to put wind farms in here. My sense is that a lot of the time it is developers and that would input into that. And I know like Keane tried really hard to bring some level of acknowledgement of the MPAs into that legislation, because you have sort of these two processes that should be running parallel. In actual fact, the MPA legislation should be first, right? Because we should be saying these are really high value biodiversity areas, and we should be protecting these no matter what. We should be identifying those first, and then the wind farm should go in after. Unfortunately, the government is doing it the other way around. Now, there was options to have interim measures in place that would protect biodiversity, but government didn't even accept those. And like Keane and the opposition parties did try put that forward. So it's leaving us in a really, it's a very difficult position.
They're using the climate crisis to say we cannot acknowledge the biodiversity.
Well, they're not saying they can't. They're saying we will, but we're just not there yet. So that's there's a few questions. Sorry, I don't know your name. What's your name? Aidan. Perfect.
Hi, Aidan from North Mayo. We're talking about the East Coast. I can actually give the West Coast perspective.
Go on, yeah.
Being from North Mayo, we're talking about like the need to get into windmills on the West Coast. It is possible, in fact some have gone up. There's an area called Belcorrick in North Mayo where it has happened. The only thing is there's a lot of local resistance. There is a way to smooth that over and has worked, which is two actions, which was firstly the locals within a certain perimeter are getting cut of profits. Money always smooths a certain proportion of people down. The other thing was local representation on a executive board. 2 spots were kept, and it was democratically elected. Now, not infighting about who got those spots, but again, when people feel they have a bit of a say and you get it over. Oh, and I'm going to be a little bit critiquing on the idea about the islands, West Coast Islands. There are unhabitable islands.
In Inishkay, like
The only thing is, I think there will be a lot of local resistance to that, because again, there's a little bit of feeling, particularly in very remote communities, that like if these things go up, really it serves the nation rather than the locality, and they feel like we're doing a favour on behalf of the nation. So again, you have to really incorporate smoothing techniques of you individually are going to get advantage of this rather than you're doing it for the good of the nation. And yeah, look, it can be done, but it has to be done in a social democratic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in relation to that as well, like one of the discussions that as a party we really led on was the whole issue of data centres, right? So like, and I was saying to Eamon Ryan, you can't talk about needing, having these targets and needing to get all these renewables and at the same time just allow this exponential growth of demand. The fact is that data centres are actually using the same amount of energy as every single individual house in rural Ireland. And yet the majority of the actions that government is implementing and needs to implement to meet the targets are individual actions. So they're saying to houses in rural Ireland, you need to pay to get your house retrofitted or take out a loan if you're not on social welfare. And yet at the same time, they're just allowing this exponential growth happen unchecked without any, we weren't saying don't have any data centres, right? That's unrealistic and we do need some. But be strategic about it. Know exactly what you're giving. Know exactly what permissions you're given. Make them pay or have recommendations and conditions so that they actually contribute to the system. It shouldn't be a free-for-all. And for a fact, I know that there's data centres who are saying charge us more for our electricity, because it's every single person in this room and every single person in this country is paying for the grid and the upgrades to the grid, which I think were estimated something like 7 billion. Right? And that's so big users like data centres could access. Now, the data centres were saying, charge us more. And the government didn't even do that. Right? So, off you go, yeah?
Yeah.
There's a few different people.
I'm a councillor in Cllr, and we've gone through the wind farm situation for years, right? Personally, my view up there, I am a believer in wind. I worked in the petroleum industry for many years in ships, and I've seen stuff which we've done to the environment, which, when I see wind farms, I'm quite happy with. I know it's not popular view of everybody, but I think we need to build them. They're clean, they're sustainable, and there is a limited amount of damage. There is going to be always damage. Development damages everything. That's build a house that's going to damage that green stuff. So in Cllr, we went through what I would call the judicial reviews, the NIMBYs group set up specifically calling themselves an environmental group. Just set up just to get rid of the wind farms. It's what I thought of it, And a lot of it's settled now, and I could be corrected on this, but a lot of law on all these wind farms, data centres, connection to wind farms, it's been litigated. Look, you'll always find something, particularly if you find something in our environmental. And my worry is that we're going to spend the next 10 years arguing up the east coast of Ireland why not to do it.
Yeah.
That's my worry.
Yeah.
Why not go with farms? We're going to have to compromise. Nobody said this journey was easy. It's not going to be easy, and more difficult decisions will have to be made. And look, if people of standing out can get judicial review for a cycle lane, what are going to do for a wind farm?
No.
And that's my concern.
Yeah.
What I said there is really important. It's really important to bring the people with you. In Cllr, they built a huge dump. And the way they got local people to kind of accept it is they have a round system every year to the sports club. It's pure blackmail, there's no but it kind of works, and if you do a more sustainable model to keep people cheaper electricity, they will, they will go. Again, we're doing the solar farms in Cllr now. Again, they're back to judicial reviews again. Why should we do it? Great land and boas. The issue is throughout a lot of political parties, but there's one political party and you might be surprised it's so particularly bad at this. And my experience in Cllr with putting in cycle lanes, partly it's the public consultation. People look for the council look for permission from itself. And the one party who's always objecting to everything is Labour. And I don't know why that is. It's not their party, their cycle schemes, and they have a leader who's a party who cycles everywhere, apparently. We know whatever, but they are consistently doing this in Dublin, they're doing this in Cllr. And it's very unfortunate, and there's no talking, and I don't know why. And I try to call them on it, and say, look, this isn't right, that you're doing this. You're supposed to be, people do cycling for reasons, it should be safe. But listen, we have to, what you say is a plan, we have to have a plan, there is no plan, you know. But I would be afraid that we'll just go down, what about the Cllr Eoin Ó Broin bridge? I was working in Dublin at the time and I brought in as a pilot. And we were told by everyone that swans were going to crash into us and we were all going to be dead. There's going to be piles of swans. We were told that they won't crash into us to happen. So we were told that in meetings they're going to crash in, don't do this, just do demonstrations. I've never yet to see a swan.
I think, do you know, I think
Don't fly into trees. You know?
it's the conversations though, isn't it? It's about talking to people like they're adults and having the conversations with people. And even like with the turf, like, oh my God, that whole argument with 3 weeks of arguing in the Dáil about turf when everyone was saying the same thing. Like even, you know, Sinn Féin was saying what the government was saying. The government had never said they were going to ban it. But what was really interesting is I went and had a look at the consultation that the government had done 3 months prior. And in the consultation document, in the first page of the review, it said, people don't understand what we're proposing here. They think you're going to ban it. And I was like, Jesus, you were told. And I said the same. I said, you were told that people didn't get it. Why didn't you get your messaging right? You know, so it's about talking to people, treating them like adults, and actually bringing them along with it. Now, there's a few. Now, look, I'm really conscious. She's like, it's nearly 3:15 already. What time do we need to?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands. Will we take them all together?
Yeah. Okay, we'll
had
do
your
that.
hand up
And
for
really
ages.
quickly, because we have to go on to the environmental motions then.
Yeah, you're next. She's first. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sinead Halpin. I'm with Cllr Central. I used to work in the renewable energy sector. I'm currently a second level teacher. I teach chemistry, computer science, and junior cert science. I could have so many things that I could talk about. I want to talk about one thing. I'm concentrating on 15-minute cities because we are talking in the moment about energy and urban generation in terms of very, very big things. But in terms of the small things that build up, we're talking about the transport of people. So I'm very lucky to live close by to where I work. The benefit of that was that we were able to go from a 2-car house to a 1-car house, but there was absolutely no reward to that. There was nothing that was given to us as a family, whereas if we'd gone and bought an EV, we would have gotten a nice big chunk of money. But also then in terms of my local school, there is a line of 5 taxis every single day to bring students to and from that school, because that is seen as the appropriate school place for children who are coming in from very, very far away, because the education that is suitable for them is not available nearby. So when we're talking about what we were talking about earlier in terms of disability access for children, we also need to talk about having that being local.
Yeah.
And constantly talking about having that be suitable for them, and also housing, having the opportunity to move within something that is going to be suitable to you as well.
Yeah.
So like I said, concentrating on just one thing, but if
15 minutes.
Will you pass the mic back?
Thanks, Sinead.
Do you want?
Yeah, well, we'll talk, but like when it comes to schools, the one thing I always say to parents is the best school is the one that's closest to you. But unfortunately, that choice isn't there for many parents, particularly parents with additional needs, or parents who don't want, they're looking for a non-ethos or a non-religious school. So,
I just wanted to say 1 or 2 things there. So I'm Ross O'Connor from Cork South West. I also work at the Marine Research Centre in offshore renewables, and I think one of the major issues, it's probably obvious to maybe some people in the room, but that a lot of this offshore wind development is, as you say, completely developer-led. I work in the GIS side of things, and my supervisor constantly says that we're doing all this GIS and spatial planning and everything, but the main issue is that there is no offshore renewable energy development. That's something that needs to be developed in policy. The government need to designate zones as they are doing with the MPAs. And these zones need to be. One of your first questions to me was, can you see them from the shore? That obviously depends on how far off they are. Ireland doesn't have any limitations on where these developers are drawing their maps at the moment for where they want to put these farms. If you compare ourselves to Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, UK, Germany, they all have a minimum distance threshold beyond which you can only place offshore wind farms. And just the final point I want to make is, it's always about offshore wind, but there are 2 other types of offshore renewable energy which are often, in fact, almost always ignored, which is wave and tidal energy. I work at the moment specifically on a wave and tide energy project, but these are very valid renewable energy types that shouldn't be ignored. I know they're not technology ready yet at the commercial scale, but in 5 years' time it could be different. And the main advantage of them for areas like the West Coast, where I'm from, is visual impact again. Because on the wide Atlantic way, you're not going to want to have huge wind farms that are visible from the coast. It's going to lead to major backlash, I think, from the local communities. And the advantage of wave is that the visual impact is very minimal. You're talking 8 meters above the sea surface compared to 260 meters with these offshore wind turbines. So there's a huge advantage of wave and tide as well. It's just something that seems to be thrown on the sub bench at the moment, and it's not talked about. But I think an inclusive term when politicians are talking about the offshore resource would be to say offshore renewable energy instead of offshore wind.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ross. We certainly must have a chat with you about the wave and tidal.
Hi, everybody. I'm Morrison from Dublin by South. 2 points. One, we talked about district heating and we talked about data centres centrally. My husband did a master's project on using excess heat from data centres into district heating, and one data centre could power, I think he's going to kill me, the numbers are about 80 pounds. So with minimal intervention, and I think maybe that could be something that the data could be included in the planning. I know in Denmark, one of the data centres powers a public swimming pool and heats the water in the pool. That sounds like public good. That's something beneficial for what we're getting. And if we could include in the planning regulations that they have to provide something with that excess heated water. Second point is I'm part of the Dublin cycling campaign as well as lockdowns. And I'm interested to hear from the panel of, we've talked about other forms of sustainable transport, but for me, getting a bike, getting a second-hand bike to get where is the most carbon efficient way to get around the city. I know it's a massive feminist issue as well. It's mainly lads that cycle, men that cycle from teenage girls. So that's why I've chosen cycling as something that I can make an impression on. And I just encourage everyone to think about these things in how it can be intersectional from so many different points of view. For me, cycling from Clonspeed to Cllr, which is 11 kilometres up or 12 kilometres uphill, is a really enjoyable way to start my day. So have a think about that when making your choices and how we can impact people around.
And what I'd love to see, and I don't know why the government hasn't done it, is like really throwing e-bikes out at everyone. They're not promoting them the way that they should. Like we're putting 10 billion is going into the subsidies for electric vehicles over the next 10 years. 10 billion.
10 billion. And we have 2 e-bikes in the house. So we have one electric cargo bike, a carbon arrow that we spent nearly £5,000 on. But that was an alternative to a second car. That's what I used to transport my children. I have 5,000 kilometres on the clock on that bike in 4 years. 3 children under 6 in my house. It's been Sockdown's campaign bus. And I just bought a second-hand, really, really comfortable e-bike to get me up that hill to Cllr. Significant. And I didn't get any benefit from buying that second-hand. And that's like, second-hand battery, all of those things. And somebody else will take
it needs the cycle lane network because people are afraid to cycle on the roads the way it is, and they're cycling on the footpaths.
And that's why I'm talking to the cycling and how to give you better route to
Okay.
Brilliant, excellent. Will you pass that across there? Oh, we've a load of other people that are coming in. I don't know. Well, I think we can talk about it. Okay. Sorry, Thomas, is it?
Yeah, Thomas, so I suppose it's like before the Greens went to the government, their policy in relation to carbon tax incorporated a dividend model whereby a large chunk of the funds raised would go towards a dividend scheme where most people would get annual payments or such that would oftentimes cover the cost that some people would experience from carbon tax in their current situation. I was just wondering, would that be, like they abandoned obviously when it went to government, would that be a model we could consider appropriating given that it could address some of the concerns people raised about the cost of carbon tax on
The ring fencing?
Yeah, the ring fences. So I suppose we are supportive of the carbon tax. Our preference is actually that the entirety of the carbon tax is spent assisting communities. So while it's not a direct payment, it does pay for retrofitting and all that. So I think that's a positive thing. But like we'll repeatedly hear the government saying carbon tax pays for this, but actually all of it doesn't. They've only ring fenced the increases over the last 2 years, I think. So actually our call is that all the carbon tax that they take in goes to support individuals and families and communities, just make those changes. So I think that, we'd be supportive of that, and I think it's important to have that.
Tax is a subject in itself. One might say it's a bit of an American approach to not trust the government to collect the tax and use it wisely, and that's why you want it ring-fenced. So I'd be a bit wary about that, because I think that's where some of that's coming from.
Now, I've no idea. Oh, Deirdre, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, perfect.
So Deirdre McCormick with the branch. So just coming back to bringing people along with you, and I'm kind of echoing what Sinead and Una were saying. We are a one-car family. We have 3 children under 6. This works for us. We're semi-rural. I can walk pretty much everywhere in my town. We don't have great bus connections. My daughter started junior infants this year, and we were seriously having to consider buying a second car to get her to school because Bus Éireann wanted to fight with us to get a bus for the school. It's a small school with 70 kids in there. So we kind of need joint up thinking, and unfortunately cycling wasn't an option, it's just not safe in our area. We need joint up thinking. We need, I know it's a stop-down policy that every child should be able to get a bus to school, they should be entitled to that. But we also need, like if I want to go to Naas, I need a car, it's 20 minutes down the road, it takes me longer to get to Tala. My bus is every 2 hours. If I want to go anywhere at any time, I have to leave my house like 2.5 to 3 hours before I'm supposed to be there. So we need joint up thinking with this thing. We need transport. So and it's going to bring people along, because a lot of people in my town have 2 cars, have 3 cars, because we need it in inverted commas, because we don't have another option. And they're giving up on climate action, and they're giving, oh sure, my car's not going to make that damage. So impossible question, but how do we get this joint up thinking?
We need a national school bus scheme. Is the first thing, and we need to invest in public transport. And I love local link buses. I think they're fantastic.
In Germany, they make the school transport free, and that's the incentive for people to not drive their kids to school.
Yeah, and the local a bus where you can go out. Everyone should be able to walk out the door and within 10-15 minutes get a bus, and not just a bus every 5 hours. There should be one, a frequent, reliable, efficient, cheap service. And actually I think if the government put the 10 billion that they're putting into EVs, if that went to public transport, that should have been the priority. Okay, last question. Okay, so I think we've the last question here. Joan, sorry, and we'll go to and actually there's loads. We need to run up. So Joan and Oisín, perfect.
Okay, I'll be super quick. Joan from Fingal. Just in relation to NIMBYs, I hate that word, but most of the NIMBYs I know are people who are fighting for environmental action for their communities. So when we're talking about compromise, we need to be very careful around that language, because we don't want to build data centres which are holding, I think, 51% of data that nobody ever uses. So I don't want to compromise on the east coast where we're pulling up special areas of conservation in order to build wind farms that potentially we don't need. So we need to really concentrate on what we do need, and when we make compromises, that they're the right compromises.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, and Oisín, thanks, Jodie.
Hi. So we're very generous so far. We've talked about half of emissions. We're missing out on about 40% here, which is agriculture. And the most polluting parts are the most heavily subsidised and least profitable as well. So, and has been subject to tribunals in the past, for instance, the meat tribunal in 98. I'm wondering what we're going to do to tackle the primary source of Ireland's pollution.
And I must say, Oisín, that was the perfect segue into the motions. Absolutely brilliant. So in relation to ag, yeah, right. So when I'm talking about ag, and myself and Holly have a lot of discussions about this, the agriculture system that we have at the moment, it doesn't work for farmers, it doesn't work for the environment, it doesn't work for rural communities. The majority aren't even able to earn a full wage from it. They have to go out and work other jobs. And it's like the subsidisation and the direction of government has forced them into an overly intensive model it's just not good for anyone. So we need to be looking to actually work with the farming community, because we need farmers, we need food, and we need to work with them to make sure that they can produce food in a more sustainable way. But I don't think I don't think the onus should be on them to find the solution. I think government should be working with them on it. And one of the points that I was making in relation to whether we're going to meet our targets, is we're going to get to 25 or 26. We're going to realise we can't reduce our targets because the infrastructure and the rollout hasn't been in place. And the one place where we could easily reduce our emissions is through the agriculture sector. And I was saying, and I said to the Taoiseach, that they're being unfair to the farming community because they're not preparing them for what could potentially come down the road. So we need to be having those discussions. We talk about just transition all the time. Just transition applies to the farming community, probably more so than any other community in this country. And yet the engagement's not there. There's this, politicians start to pretend it's not going to impact. It's going to impact the farming community. It's going to impact every community. And I think we need to work with them to prepare them and make sure that they can have sustainable businesses coming out of this, essentially.
I just would like to say, I'm very sorry, I know you want to crack up. Just, I would like to see us think as a party, considering to think outside the box, to stop thinking wind all the time, to think of other things other than renewables. And I really would like to know who and where within the party and what our approach to nuclear power, or considering nuclear power as a very much renewable, green and clean. 75% of France are using it. I mean, Macron is, they're not stupid, they're clean and they're green. And I think the engineers of Ireland are 18 to 0. They're fantastic.
I said energy systems modelling started with the oil crisis in the 70s. Many countries made plans to move away from fossil fuels. Canada implemented it, and France implemented it, Sweden implemented it. That's why they have it correct. They did that. Yeah, Germany did it, Japan did it. But Germany closed them down 10 years ago, and that's why they've had to, they're so reliant on fossil fuels. But but here in Ireland, we had a massive campaigns in Carnsore Point in 79, 80. It is a long time ago, but we had a choice then, and I think sure, it is safer. It is safer now. Things might move on because of the climate crisis, but maybe Ireland's too small anyway for.
Finland.
Yeah, but they haven't built it. They've had 10 years to build it, and they haven't managed it.
Finland are now at least 25% nuclear.
But we can't even get a cycle in.
It costs a fortune.
So it's like there's sort of logistical issues as well. So I'm going to move. We're going to move to Sheila. We're going to move to Sheila because we have motions and we've gone way over, and she'll start giving us the dagger eyes now very shortly. Okay, Belle. Do you want us to go down, Sheila?
Thanks very much. Yeah, if you want, yeah. Thanks a million to Jennifer and Cllr Eoin Ó Broin.